The morning light filtered through the tall, arched windows of the federal courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. It was 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, and the hallways buzzed with the quiet urgency that always preceded high-stakes legal proceedings. The air smelled of furniture polish, aged wood, and something else, the unmistakable scent of human anxiety. Officer James Henderson sat in the back row of courtroom 7B, his muscular German Shepherd K9 partner, positioned beside him with perfect obedience. Was 11 years old in dog years, which made him middle-aged by canine standards, but his dark, intelligent eyes and alert posture suggested a dog still very much in his prime. His mahogany and black coat had been recently groomed, his nails trimmed, and his collar polished. To any observer, looked like what he was, one of the most accomplished K9 officers in the state's police department. For 8 years, had tracked criminals across 3 states. He'd located missing persons in dense forests when all hope seemed lost. He'd sniffed out explosives at the city's international airport, preventing potential tragedies. He detected narcotics hidden in vehicle compartments that human officers would have searched for hours without success. His service record was legendary among law enforcement circles. Other K9 handlers Officer Henderson's partnership with. The dog had a near-perfect success rate and an uncanny ability to remain calm under pressure. But sitting in this courtroom on this particular morning, James Henderson couldn't shake the feeling that today's mission was somehow different from all the others. The courtroom itself was a study in intimidation. High ceilings soared above dark oak paneling that had witnessed decades of human drama. The judge's bench loomed at the front like a throne, elevated above the well of the court. 2 tables faced each other, one for each side, creating an adversarial landscape that was as much psychological as it was legal. American flags stood in corners. The Great Seal of the state hung prominently behind the judge's chair. Everything about the space was designed to convey authority, permanence, and the weight of justice. It was into this imposing environment that 4-year-old Emma Martinez was led through the side door at precisely 10:00 a.m. She was impossibly small. That was Officer Henderson's first thought. The child seemed almost swallowed by the courtroom's vastness. She wore a pink cotton dress with white lace trim, and her small feet dangled above the floor when she sat, not quite reaching the ground. Her dark hair, carefully braided by her mother that morning, fell past her small shoulders. But it was her eyes that captured everyone's attention. They were wide, haunted, searching for safety in a room full of strangers and hostile intentions. Emma's hand trembled as it gripped the hand of Miss Sarah, her court-appointed child advocate. Ms. was a woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and gentle features, someone who had witnessed countless children traumatized by custody disputes and family violence. She squeezed Emma's hand reassuringly, but even she looked uncertain about what this day might bring. 20 years of experience had taught her that no 2 child witnesses were the same, and predicting how a 4-year-old would respond to the pressure of a courtroom was nearly impossible. The moment Emma entered, both of her parents tensed visibly. On the left side of the courtroom sat David Martinez, Emma's father, age 36. He wore an expensive suit that didn't quite hide his agitation. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles worked visibly beneath his skin. His lawyer, Ms. Victoria Thornton, a sharp-eyed attorney known for her aggressive cross-examination tactics, placed a reassuring hand on his arm. David's eyes fixed on his daughter with an intensity that made several courtroom observers uncomfortable. It wasn't an expression of warmth or fatherly love. It was calculating, as if he were trying to predict what the child might say. On the right side of the courtroom sat Isabella Martinez, Emma's mother, age 34. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she clutched a tissue. Beside her was her attorney, Mr. Robert, no relation to the child advocate, a thoughtful-looking man in his 50s who specialized in custody cases involving allegations of domestic violence. Isabella's eyes never left her daughter, and tears were already beginning to form at the corners of her eyes. Judge sat at the bench, reviewing her notes. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of face that had witnessed too much human suffering. She'd been on the bench for 23 years, and her reputation was that of a judge who could see through deception and possessed an almost supernatural ability to discern the truth. But even Judge looked somewhat troubled by what lay ahead. This case had been anything but ordinary. 6 months earlier, Isabella had filed for emergency custody, alleging that David had been physically and emotionally abusive. She claimed he had anger management issues and that his volatility created an unsafe environment for Emma. David, meanwhile, painted himself as a victim, a devoted father who was being falsely accused by an ex-partner who wanted to poison his relationship with his daughter and deny him access. The evidence was mixed and inconclusive. There were police reports but no convictions. There were hospital records, but they were from incidents years ago. There were witness statements from family members, but they contradicted each other, as family members often did in custody disputes. What was missing was the one voice that mattered most: Emma's own account of what she had witnessed and experienced in her father's home. And that's why she was here today. Judge adjusted her glasses and looked down at the small child who had just been seated in the witness chair, a special high-backed chair that had been specially modified so that Emma's head would be at a reasonable height, so she wouldn't look so impossibly tiny and vulnerable. A Bible was placed in front of her, though Emma couldn't read it. The bailiff began the oath. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" Emma's voice was barely audible. "Yes." Officer Henderson felt shift slightly beside him. The dog seemed to sense the tension in the room, the weight of what was about to unfold. Henderson's hand rested gently on his collar, grounding both himself and his partner. Judge leaned forward, her expression gentle but her intention serious. She was about to ask questions that could alter the course of a 4-year-old girl's entire life. Everyone in that courtroom knew it. The silence felt absolute, sacred almost, a moment before everything changed. "Emma," Judge began, her voice warm but official, "can you tell the court about your home?" Emma's small fingers gripped the edge of the witness chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then looked down at her lap. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 seconds, though in courtroom time, 5 seconds felt like 5 minutes. "It's okay, sweetheart," Judge said gently, her voice carrying that practiced compassion that came from years of dealing with frightened witnesses. "There's no wrong answer here. I just want to hear about your home. Do you live with mommy or daddy mostly?" Emma's eyes darted toward her mother, then quickly away. Her lower lip began to tremble visibly. In the gallery, Ms. leaned forward slightly, ready to intervene if the child became too distressed. Officer Henderson noticed that his ears had perked up. The dog sensed distress the way he sensed explosives or drugs, through some mysterious canine mechanism that transcended normal human understanding. I live," Emma started, her voice so quiet that the courtroom stenographer had to lean forward to catch the words. Sometimes at Daddy's house, and sometimes at Mommy's house." It was a simple answer, but it was something. Judge nodded encouragingly. "And do you like living at both houses equally, Emma, or do you feel safer at one place more than the other?" This was the critical question. This was what everyone in the courtroom was waiting for. This was the moment that could determine the entire trajectory of Emma's childhood. Both attorneys held their breath. Emma's body went rigid. She began to swing her legs, a self-soothing behavior that suggested mounting anxiety. Her eyes filled with tears that hadn't yet spilled over. They're both." She stopped mid-sentence and looked directly at her father. David Martinez's face hardened. His hand clenched into a fist on the table in front of him. Ms. Thornton, his attorney, immediately placed her hand over his, a silent warning to maintain composure. But the damage was done. Emma had seen her father's reaction to her hesitation, and it had clearly frightened her even more. "Emma," Judge prompted, "it's very important that you answer honestly. No one is going to be upset with you for telling the truth. This is a safe place." But it wasn't a safe place. Not really. Emma was a 4-year-old child in a room full of hostile adults, with the most important people in her life sitting on opposite sides, both waiting to hear words that would either validate or condemn them. The tension in that courtroom was suffocating. "Daddy's house is," Emma's voice cracked. "Sometimes Daddy is happy and we play games and he reads me stories. But sometimes Daddy gets really, really loud and he says mean words and—" She trailed off, her eyes welling with fresh tears. Miss Thornton, David's attorney, immediately stood up. "Your Honor, I object to this line of questioning. The witness is clearly too young and emotionally compromised to provide reliable testimony. She's been coached." "Coached?" Isabella's attorney, Mr. Robert, jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, that's completely inappropriate and unfounded. My client has been trying to protect her daughter from—" "Enough," Judge said sharply, her gavel coming down with a decisive crack. "Miss Thornton, there is no evidence of coaching. Sit down. Mister, you'll have your opportunity to address the court. For now, everyone please remain silent." The courtroom fell into an uneasy quiet, but the damage had been done. Emma had witnessed the adults around her arguing about her words, about whether she was telling the truth. She had seen her father's rage barely contained behind his attorney's hand. She had heard her mother's lawyer defending her, and she was only 4 years old. "Emma," Judge said, her voice gentler now, "let's take a different approach. Can you tell me what happens at Daddy's house when Daddy gets really loud?" Emma shook her head violently. "I don't want to talk about it," she whispered. "It's important, sweetheart. If you tell me what happens, then I can help make sure you're safe." But Emma wasn't convinced. She had learned in her 4 years of life that words had consequences. Words made adults angry. Words made things worse. She pulled her hand away from the armrest and wrapped both her small arms around herself in a self-protective gesture that would have broken any parent's heart. "Emma, can you at least tell me if you feel scared at Daddy's house?" Judge tried again, rephrasing the question to make it simpler, more binary. Surely a 4-year-old could answer whether she felt scared or not. But Emma just shook her head again and stared down at her pink dress. A single tear rolled down her cheek, followed by another. Her chest began to heave slightly. She was crying silently, her body expressing the distress that her words could not. "Your Honor," Ms. the child advocate, stood up from her seat in the gallery. "I think Emma needs a break. She's becoming increasingly distressed, and continuing this line of questioning may cause further psychological harm." Judge's face showed clear frustration. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was only 10:23 a.m. They'd been at this for less than 25 minutes, and already the child witness was falling apart. Without the clear testimony of the child herself, the judge would have to rely entirely on circumstantial evidence, police reports, and allegations that both sides disputed. "Very well," Judge said, though her tone suggested she was deeply unhappy with the situation. "We'll take a brief recess. Ms., please take Emma to the holding area. Make her comfortable. Provide her with water and any comfort items you see fit." As Ms. stood and gently took Emma's trembling hand, the child glanced back at her mother, and then at her father. Both parents looked devastated and frustrated in equal measure. The courtroom began to buzz with whispered conversations as bailiffs stood and attorneys huddled with their clients. Judge remained on the bench, her expression contemplative and troubled. Officer Henderson could see it in her face. The judge was worried. A custody case couldn't be decided on a traumatized child's fearful silence. There had to be testimony, concrete statements, admissions, or denials. But how could you extract honest answers from a 4-year-old who was clearly terrified? It was a problem that seemed, at that moment, entirely unsolvable. The hallway outside courtroom 7B was quieter than the main corridors of the courthouse. It was a secondary passage, used primarily by court personnel and law enforcement, which meant it had a different atmosphere, less formal, more utilitarian. The walls were painted a neutral beige, and the fluorescent overhead lights cast a slightly sterile glow across the tile floor. It was during the recess, in this quiet hallway, that everything changed. Ms. had gently led Emma to a small waiting area just outside the courtroom, a room with comfortable chairs, coloring books, and a few stuffed animals. "You did very well in there, Emma," Ms. had said softly, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Emma had barely spoken, but Ms. had learned long ago that validating a child's effort, regardless of outcome, was important for maintaining their sense of self-worth. Emma sat in one of the chairs, her small body curled into a ball, her knees pulled up to her chest. She wasn't coloring. She wasn't playing with the stuffed animals. She was simply sitting, staring at nothing, her pink dress a stark contrast to the neutral colors around her. She looked exhausted, despite being only 4 years old. Trauma had a way of aging children prematurely, of stealing their lightness and replacing it with a heaviness that no child should ever have to carry. Officer James Henderson, meanwhile, was preparing to take back to the vehicle. The K-9 unit was stationed several blocks away, and Henderson had been instructed to keep out of sight during the proceedings. Dogs could be unpredictable in formal settings, and the judge preferred to keep the courtroom environment as controlled as possible. Henderson attached his leash and began walking toward the nearest exit, the same hallway where Ms. had taken Emma. What happened next was something that no one could have predicted or orchestrated, despite what skeptics might later suggest. Suddenly pulled on his leash, not violently or aggressively but with purposeful intention. His nose had caught a scent, not drugs, not explosives, but something else entirely. To an untrained observer, it might have looked like was simply being disobedient, attempting to pull toward an interesting smell. But Officer Henderson, who had worked with for 8 years, knew better. There was a quality to this pull that was different. It wasn't predatory or excited. It was gentle, almost investigative. "Easy, boy," Henderson said, gently correcting the dog, but was insistent. His dark eyes were fixed on something down the hallway, specifically on the small figure curled up in the waiting area chair. Henderson followed the direction of his gaze and saw Emma. The officer's first instinct was to pull away, to maintain professional boundaries. But then he saw something in the way was looking at the child, a kind of recognition, as if the dog understood something about her distress. "Just a minute," Henderson said softly, making a decision that was, strictly speaking, against protocol. He guided the dog toward the waiting area. Ms. looked up from her phone where she'd been making notes about Emma's emotional state. She started to stand, ready to protect the child from any potential stress, but something in the way the dog moved made her pause. There was no threat in his posture. His body language was open, non-threatening, almost reverent. Approached Emma slowly, his pace deliberate and measured. A well-trained K-9 dog had been trained to approach suspects, to search buildings, to track scents over miles of difficult terrain. But he had also been trained, both formally and informally, to recognize vulnerability. Police dogs, by nature, were protectors, and in this moment seemed to recognize that the small pink-dressed child in the chair was someone who needed protection. Emma, sensing movement, looked up. Her tear-stained face, red from crying, registered surprise and then something else, wonder. Her eyes, which had been dull and frightened just moments before, suddenly widened with a kind of innocent curiosity that only children possessed. "Puppy?" Emma's voice was barely audible, but it was filled with a tentative hope that hadn't been present in the courtroom. Approached closer, and then, in a gesture that seemed almost choreographed, he gently lowered his massive head until it was at Emma's eye level. For a dog that weighed 85 pounds, moved with surprising delicacy, as if he understood that this small human before him was fragile. Emma's arms, which had been wrapped around her knees just moments before, suddenly unwrapped. She leaned forward slightly, and then, With the unself-consciousness that only children could muster, she wrapped both her small arms around his neck. Her face buried itself in his mahogany and black fur. Officer Henderson felt something catch in his chest. He'd seen perform countless duties, but he'd never witnessed anything quite like this. The dog remained absolutely still, allowing the child to embrace him completely. Didn't lick her face or attempt to move. He simply stood there, an immovable presence, an anchor in a storm. Ms. watched carefully, her professional instincts warring with what she was witnessing. Protocol suggested she should intervene. Yet every instinct born from 20 years of working with traumatized children told her that this moment was sacred, necessary healing. Emma remained with her face pressed against fur for what felt like an eternity. Her small body, which had been so tense and rigid in the courtroom, seemed to soften. Her breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to deepen and slow. And then, so quietly that barely anyone could hear it, she began to whisper something into his ear. "It's okay, puppy," she murmured. "You're safe, I'm safe with you. Nobody yells at you, nobody hurts you." Officer Henderson felt tears prick the corners of his own eyes. The child wasn't just seeking comfort from the dog. She was offering comfort, as if her own need to nurture and protect someone, even an 85-pound police dog, was somehow therapeutic. 30 seconds passed, then 60 seconds, then 90 seconds, an eternity in child time where every moment stretched out with profound significance. When Emma finally pulled back, her face had transformed. The terror was still there, background anxiety that wouldn't disappear overnight, but something fundamental had shifted. Her eyes had regained a spark. Her face, though still wet with tears, bore a subtle smile, the first genuine smile she'd produced all morning. Officer Henderson watched as gently licked Emma's cheek once, just once, in what looked like a gesture of reassurance rather than excitement. "Thank you," Ms. said softly to Officer Henderson, though her eyes remained on Emma, "and I think she needed that." "I think she did too," Henderson replied, his voice rough with emotion. As he gently guided away, both officer and dog glanced back at the small girl multiple times. Emma watched them go, her hand raised in a small wave, her expression no longer one of despair. Something miraculous had just occurred in that quiet hallway, something that would echo through the rest of the day's proceedings in ways no one could anticipate. The courtroom reconvened at 11:15 a.m., exactly 45 minutes after the recess had begun. Judge sat at her bench, reviewing additional documents that had been filed during the break. Both attorneys had taken the time to strategize with their respective clients. Isabella had spent the recess in a small consultation room with Mr. going over the case strategy. David had done the same with Ms. Thornton, though his demeanor suggested frustration rather than confidence. But it was Emma who commanded immediate attention when she was brought back into the courtroom. The transformation was undeniable and impossible to miss. The child who had been brought back was not quite the same terrified, silenced girl who had fled the witness chair just 45 minutes earlier. Emma walked with Ms. into the courtroom, and this time, instead of clinging desperately to her advocate's hand, she held it with what appeared to be a quiet determination. Her head was held higher. The vacant, terrified expression had been replaced with something that resembled resolve, or perhaps the kind of courage that only comes when a child has been reminded, by the simple presence of a gentle creature, that there are safe things in this world. Judge's eyebrows rose slightly as she observed the change. She'd been presiding over custody cases for 2 decades, and she recognized the significance of what she was witnessing. Something had happened during that 45-minute recess, something that had fundamentally altered the child's emotional state. She made a mental note to inquire about it later. Emma was reseated in the modified witness chair. Ms. positioned herself nearby, though not as close as before. There was a confidence in the child's bearing now that suggested she might be able to navigate this without holding her advocate's hand every moment. "Emma," Judge began, her voice gentle but businesslike, "before our break, we were talking about your home. I'd like to continue that conversation if that's all right with you." Emma nodded. It was a small gesture, but it represented a monumental shift from her previous reluctance. "You mentioned that sometimes Daddy's house has happy times, and sometimes Daddy gets really loud. Can you tell me a little bit more about what happens when Daddy gets loud?" Emma's eyes flickered toward her father, and Judge immediately registered the child's cautious assessment of his reaction. But this time, instead of being intimidated into silence, Emma seemed to be evaluating the situation like a small strategist. She was calculating risks, weighing consequences, and then, apparently deciding that the truth was more important than fear, she began to speak. "Daddy gets loud," she said, her voice small but clear. "His face gets red. He says mean words, he says. He says that Mommy is bad and that she doesn't love me, but that's not true. Mommy loves me." David Martinez's face flushed. His hand moved as if to stand, but Ms. Thornton's grip on his arm held him firmly in place. She shook her head slightly, a silent warning. "Don't make this worse." "Has Daddy ever frightened you when he gets loud?" Judge asked. "Yes," Emma said simply. "I get scared, my tummy hurts, I want Mommy." "And does Daddy ever break things or hurt things when he gets loud?" Emma nodded. "He broke Mommy's lamp. He said bad words and broke the lamp and Mommy cried." In the gallery, several observers exchanged glances. The lamp incident was documented in the police report. It had been filed as evidence of the incident that had prompted Isabella's emergency custody petition. This 4-year-old child had just corroborated a key piece of evidence through her own eyewitness account. "Has Daddy ever hurt Mommy?" Judge pressed gently, asking the most critical question with careful precision. Emma's body went rigid. This was the question she'd been unable to answer before, the one that had sent her into silent tears in the courtroom's cold environment. But now, something was different. Her hand moved, reaching toward the space beside her, as if searching for something that wasn't there. Her fingers grasped at empty air. And in that moment, Officer Henderson, who had re-entered the courtroom only moments before made a critical observation. He saw the child's hand reaching, saw her eyes dart toward where was now sitting, and he made an immediate decision that would later become the most controversial and praised choice of his career. Officer Henderson guided toward the witness stand. Ms. Thornton stood immediately. "Your Honor, I object to this. The presence of an animal is highly irregular and—" "It's not hurting anything," Mr. interrupted, also standing. "If it helps the witness provide testimony, I don't see the harm." Judge raised her hand, silencing both attorneys. She studied Officer Henderson with an expression of careful assessment. "Officer Henderson, I appreciate your initiative here, but I need to understand what's happening. Why are you bringing the dog closer?" "Your Honor," Henderson said carefully, choosing his words with precision, "I'm not trained in child psychology, but I am trained in observing behavioral patterns. The witness appears to have had a positive interaction with during the recess. Her emotional state has improved significantly. I believe her proximity to the dog may facilitate her testimony." It was a reasonable explanation, though it bent protocol considerably. Judge considered it for a long moment. The clock ticked. The courtroom held its breath. "This is highly unusual," Judge said finally. "But in the interest of justice and the welfare of the child, I'm going to allow it. However, Ms. Thornton, I want to state for the record that this does not constitute evidence or influence the credibility of the witness. The dog is merely a comfort object. Is that clear?" "Your Honor, I still object," Ms. Thornton said, but her tone suggested she recognized she'd already lost this battle. Was positioned directly beside Emma's chair, and the moment the dog settled into place, the transformation was visible to everyone. Emma's entire body relaxed. Her small hand immediately found collar, gripping it the way a child might grip a life preserver in deep water. "Emma," Judge said, her voice carrying a note of gentle urgency, "can you answer my question? Has Daddy ever hurt Mommy?" Emma looked down drew in a deep breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep inside her small frame, and then she spoke. "One time," she said, her voice trembling but determined, "Daddy pushed Mommy. She fell down and she cried. Her arm was bleeding. Daddy said he was sorry and said he would never do it again. But he did it again. Another time he yelled so loud and Mommy was scared and she took me to Mrs. House." The courtroom erupted into motion. Both attorneys were on their feet. David Martinez's face had turned a shade of crimson that suggested he might be having a medical emergency. Isabella was crying openly, her hand covering her mouth. Judge's gavel came down with an authoritative crack. "Order, order in the court." But the damage was done. Emma had spoken. The truth, locked away in a 4-year-old's traumatized heart, had finally been released into the world. And the single thing that had made that possible was the reassuring presence of an 85-pound German Shepherd police dog. Everything in the case had just changed. The courtroom descended into chaos that lasted only seconds before Judge's authoritative voice cut through the noise like a blade through silk. Her gavel came down 3 times in rapid succession. Crack, 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 each strike reverberating through the chamber with the weight of judicial authority. "Silence! I will have order in this courtroom or I will have it cleared. That includes you, Mr. Martinez. Sit down or I will have the bailiff escort you out." David Martinez stood frozen for a moment, his face a mottled combination of rage and fear. His attorney, Ms. Thornton, placed both hands on his shoulders and firmly pushed him back into his chair. For a breathless moment, it seemed as though he might resist, might stand up again and create a full scene. But the look in Judge's eyes, cold, absolute, unforgiving, apparently convinced him otherwise. The courtroom fell into a tense silence that was somehow worse than the commotion that had preceded it. Everyone could feel the critical nature of what was happening. The pivot point had arrived. "Officer Henderson," Judge said, her tone measured but firm, "I appreciate your intervention, but I need to address the legal implications of what you've just done. Ms. Thornton, I want arguments. How do both of you propose we proceed? The witness has demonstrated increased emotional stability with the dog present. However, there are legitimate concerns about whether this constitutes an improper influence on testimony." Ms. Thornton stood immediately, her sharp features arranged in an expression of controlled outrage. She was a woman who'd built her career on strict adherence to procedural rules, and what was happening in her courtroom violated nearly every one of them. "Your Honor," she began, her voice crisp and professional despite her clear frustration, "the presence of an animal in the witness box sets an extraordinarily dangerous precedent. We have no scientific evidence that this dog's presence improves testimony accuracy. In fact, psychological literature suggests that animals can serve as confabulation facilitators. They can actually increase the likelihood that a witness, particularly a young child, will fabricate or distort memories to match perceived expectations. Furthermore, this dog is a police animal, which could be interpreted as the court implicitly endorsing law enforcement's narrative. My client has a constitutional right to confront his accuser, and I would argue that the presence of this animal constitutes an attempt to intimidate him and bias the jury, or in this case, the court, against him." It was a well-constructed argument, professionally delivered, and every word of it carried legal weight. Several observers in the gallery nodded in agreement. The rules of evidence existed for a reason, after all. They were designed to protect the integrity of the judicial process. Mr. stood next, and his approach was markedly different. He was more measured, more philosophical, less combative. "Your Honor," he said, adjusting his glasses, I understand Ms. Thornton's concerns about precedent and procedural integrity. Those are legitimate considerations. However, I would argue that the paramount concern in any custody case involving a minor should be the best interests of the child. This child has been severely traumatized. She was unable to testify effectively before the recess. Now, with the dog present, she is providing clear, coherent, detailed testimony about incidents that are corroborated by police reports and other evidence. The dog is not testifying. The dog is not making arguments. The dog is simply providing comfort to a traumatized child, enabling her to access her own memories and speak truthfully about them. He paused, letting his words settle into the courtroom's atmosphere. Furthermore, he continued, the presence of the dog does not prejudice Mr. Martinez's right to cross-examination. Ms. Thornton will have full opportunity to challenge Emma's testimony, to test its credibility, to explore alternative explanations. The dog is merely a conduit to truth, not an obstacle to defense. Judge listened to both arguments, her expression revealing nothing. She was a woman who'd learned long ago to keep her thoughts hidden until she was ready to speak them into law. She looked from Ms. Thornton to Mr., then to Officer Henderson, then to Emma, who sat quietly beside, her small hand still gripping the dog's collar. Finally, she spoke. "This is highly irregular," she began, her voice carrying the weight of her years on the bench. "Ms. Thornton is correct that we are entering uncharted legal territory. However, I am also struck by a fundamental reality. This child was traumatized and unable to communicate 5 minutes ago. Now, with the dog present, she is able to speak. Whether that is because the dog is actually facilitating her testimony, or whether it is simply a psychological effect is, frankly, irrelevant to me at this moment. My primary obligation is to this child's welfare and to the truth of what occurred in her father's home." She paused, then continued with measured deliberation. "I am going to allow the dog to remain in proximity to the witness. However, I am establishing clear parameters. First, the dog will not be touched or interacted with by counsel during cross-examination. Second, I am noting for the record that the dog's presence is solely for purposes of providing emotional support and does not constitute evidence of any kind. Third, Ms. Thornton will have full opportunity to cross-examine the witness and to challenge the reliability of her testimony. Fourth, this decision is specific to this child in this case and does not set broader precedent for future proceedings. Is that clear?" "Your Honor," Ms. Thornton began to protest, but Judge raised her hand. "My decision is final, Ms. Thornton. You may note your objection for the record. Now let's proceed." There was a moment of heavy silence. Everyone understood that a line had been crossed, that something unprecedented was occurring in this courtroom. But everyone also understood that sometimes justice required stepping beyond the boundaries of established procedure. Judge turned her attention back to Emma. "Emma, I need to ask you some very important questions. Before we do that, I want you to know that I'm going to ask Mr. Martinez's lawyer some questions too. That's her job. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It just means everyone gets to ask questions. Okay?" Emma nodded, her fingers tightening slightly on his collar. "Emma, you said that Daddy pushed Mommy and she fell and her arm was bleeding. Can you tell me more about that? When did that happen? Do you remember?" Emma took a deep breath. Her eyes moved from Judge to as if drawing courage from the dog's steady presence. It was before the time Mommy took me to Mrs. house. Daddy was yelling about money. He said Mommy spent too much money on me. And Mommy said she did the best she could. And Daddy said she was a bad mother and she didn't deserve to have me. And Mommy started to cry." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Everyone was listening with a kind of intensity that suggested they understood they were hearing something crucial. And then, Judge prompted gently. "And then Daddy got really angry and he pushed Mommy and she fell down and her arm had blood on it. And she cried a lot. And Daddy said he was sorry and said it would never happen again. But it did happen again. It did. When did it happen again? Emma's voice became quieter, more tremulous. I don't remember the exact time, but Daddy got angry again. Not as bad, but he pushed her again. And Mommy was really scared. She put me in the car and we went to Mrs. House and Mommy cried all night. In the gallery, Isabella was crying openly, her face buried in her hands. Mr. placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, though his own expression suggested that hearing these details, even though he believed them to be true, was emotionally devastating. Emma, Judge said carefully, I have one more very important question. Do you feel safe living at your daddy's house? Emma looked then at her mother, then at the judge. No, she said simply. I don't feel safe. My tummy hurts when I'm there. I'm scared Daddy will hurt Mommy again. The statement hung in the air like a verdict that had already been delivered. Judge nodded slowly, her expression grave. Thank you for being very brave and telling me the truth, Emma. I know that was hard. Judge leaned back in her chair, her expression reflecting the gravity of what she had just heard. She removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, a gesture that suggested the weight of the decision-making process she was undertaking. When she replaced her glasses and looked at Miss Thornton, her gaze was steady but carried an implicit warning. Miss Thornton, you may begin your cross-examination, Judge said formally. However, I remind you that this is a 4-year-old child. Your questions should be age-appropriate and not designed to intimidate or confuse. Miss Thornton stood, straightening her navy suit jacket as she prepared her approach. She was experienced enough to know that a harsh cross-examination of a young child would play poorly, not just with the judge, but with the court record that would later be reviewed if this case proceeded to appeal. She had to be strategic, careful, and professional, even though every fiber of her legal being wanted to aggressively challenge the child's testimony. Emma, Miss Thornton began, her voice measured and calm, has anyone told you what to say today? Has Mommy or Ms. or anyone else told you what words to use when you talk to the judge? Emma shook her head. No, she said simply. Are you sure? Because sometimes grown-ups tell kids stories, and then kids remember the stories instead of what really happened. Did that happen? No, Emma said again, though her grip on his collar tightened noticeably. The dog seemed to sense her anxiety and shifted slightly closer, his weight pressing gently against her leg. Miss Thornton pressed forward, her approach now shifting to creating doubt about memory and perception. Emma, how many times has Daddy pushed Mommy? Was it 2 times? 3 times? Can you remember exactly? Emma hesitated, her mind working through the question. I remember 2 times that I saw, but there might have been other times when I was sleeping or playing in my room. It was a devastatingly honest answer. A coached child would have given a specific number. A confused child might have guessed wildly. But Emma had given a response that demonstrated genuine effort to be truthful while acknowledging the limits of her knowledge. The kind of answer that actually increased her credibility rather than diminishing it. Miss Thornton tried another angle. Emma, do you love your daddy? The question hung in the air like a trap. Both attorneys knew what Emma's answer might indicate about her reliability. If she said no, she seemed biased. If she said yes, it suggested the situation might not be as dire as her testimony indicated. Emma looked down at and her hand continued to grip his collar. When she spoke, her voice was small but filled with heartbreaking complexity. I love Daddy sometimes, she said. When he's nice to me and we play games and he reads me stories, but I don't like it when he's angry, and I don't like when he hurts Mommy. It was the kind of nuanced emotional response that only a real child, struggling with the actual complicated feelings children have toward parents who both love them and frighten them, could produce. A coached response would have been simpler, more black and white. Ms. Thornton recognized that she was losing ground. She tried to shift tactics. Emma, when Daddy pushes Mommy, does he push her hard, or does he just push her like this? She made a gentle pushing motion with her hand. It's hard pushing, Emma said. Mommy falls down. One time she cried because her arm hurt. But parents sometimes push children or other people when they're playing, don't they? Like when you're playing a game. This wasn't playing, Emma said firmly, with a certainty that seemed to shock Ms. Thornton. Daddy wasn't smiling. Daddy was angry. Mommy was scared. Judge made a note on her legal pad, her expression unchanged but her attention sharply focused. She was documenting everything, building the record that would support whatever decision she ultimately rendered. Ms. Thornton continued for another 15 minutes, but her line of questioning was becoming increasingly ineffective. She tried to suggest that Emma had misinterpreted innocent situations, that children often confused games with aggression, that memory at age 4 was inherently unreliable. But Emma remained consistent. Her details didn't waver. And most importantly, whenever her anxiety threatened to overwhelm her, she would look down at, draw strength from the dog's calm presence, and continue speaking. Finally, Ms. Thornton sat down, her face bearing the expression of someone who had fought a battle and lost. She couldn't shake the child's testimony. She couldn't demonstrate that it was false or coached. She couldn't create reasonable doubt about what Emma had witnessed. Mr. stood for redirect examination, the opportunity to ask follow-up questions that might rehabilitate or clarify Emma's testimony after cross-examination. His approach was entirely different from Ms. Thornton's aggressive stance. Emma, when you said Daddy pushed Mommy and she fell and her arm was bleeding, do you remember what time of day that was? Was it morning, afternoon, or nighttime? It was afternoon, Emma said. I remember because my cartoon was on TV and Daddy interrupted it by yelling. Do you remember what day of the week it was? It was a Sunday, Emma said, because Daddy doesn't go to work on Sundays. The specific details were damaging to David Martinez's defense. They suggested genuine memory, not fabrication. They were the kinds of peripheral details that real witnesses remembered, the cartoon on television, the day of the week, not the kinds of things a coached child would necessarily include. Emma, when you went to Mrs. House with Mommy, did Mommy tell you to say things that weren't true? No, Emma said firmly. Mommy just said we needed to stay safe. She said Daddy was angry and we needed to go somewhere safe. And did Mommy ever ask you to tell a judge things that weren't true? No, Mommy said I should tell the truth about what happened. Mr. paused, letting that clear, simple statement settle into the record. Then he asked his final question, the one that would become the most damaging to David Martinez's case. Emma, if you go back to live at Daddy's house full-time, are you afraid of what might happen? Emma's entire body seemed to collapse inward. Her hand, which had been gripping Scott's collar, now clutched it desperately. Tears began to stream down her face, not the controlled tears of someone being manipulated, but the genuine, wrenching sobs of a traumatized child confronting her deepest fear. I'm scared Daddy will hurt Mommy again, she whispered. I'm scared Daddy will hurt me. I'm scared. I'm scared Daddy will be so angry that he does something really bad. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. Even the bailiffs, accustomed to the dramas of court proceedings, appeared moved by the raw emotion in the child's words. Officer Henderson felt shift slightly. The dog's body pressed more firmly against Emma's leg, as if the animal understood that this was the moment when the child needed him most. Judge made extensive notes, her expression grave and sorrowful. She had heard countless custody cases over 2 decades, had listened to allegations, and had made decisions that affected the lives of thousands of children. But there was something about this particular testimony, the specificity of the details, the emotional authenticity, the way the child's anxiety both increased and decreased with the dog's presence, that suggested she was witnessing something that transcended typical courtroom drama. This was a child's cry for help, and the court had heard it. Judge sat alone in her chambers after the courtroom had been cleared. It was 3:47 p.m. on that Tuesday in March, and the afternoon light slanted through her office windows at an angle that suggested the day was waning. She sat at her mahogany desk, which had been in this office for 17 years, and she stared at the legal pad in front of her, filled with notes, observations, and the skeletal outline of a decision that would alter the trajectory of at least 3 lives. The chambers were quiet in a way that courtrooms never were. There were no attorneys to interrupt, no bailiffs to issue instructions, no crying child to concern her. Just alone with the weight of judicial authority and the responsibility that came with it. On the wall behind her desk hung her law degree from Yale, framed photographs of her graduating class, and a plaque commemorating her appointment to the bench. These items represented a lifetime of education and professional achievement, but in this moment, they felt almost hollow in the face of the decision she had to make. She picked up the court transcript, the official record of everything that had been said in her courtroom that day. Her secretary had expedited the typing, understanding the urgency of the situation. Judge read through it carefully, paying particular attention to Emma's testimony. She read the child's words again and again, examining them for inconsistencies, for signs of fabrication or coaching. But there were none. The testimony was remarkably consistent. The details were specific but not so specific as to suggest memorization. The emotional responses seemed genuine and appropriately contextual. And perhaps most importantly, the child's answers had held up under aggressive cross-examination from a skilled attorney. Judge also reviewed the police reports, the hospital records, the prior complaints that had been filed but never prosecuted. She read the statements from neighbors who had reported hearing arguments and raised voices. She examined the documentation of Isabella's emergency room visit 2 years prior, when she had presented with a fractured arm and bruising consistent with physical assault, an incident she had initially attributed to a fall, but which, in light of Emma's testimony, took on entirely different significance. And then there was the matter of the K9 police dog, who had somehow managed to do what all the judge's years of experience and legal training could not: provide a traumatized child with the capacity to speak her truth. Judge had been on the bench long enough to know the rules of evidence, the proper procedures, the established protocols. She knew that allowing an animal in the witness area was irregular. She knew that some appellate court might view her decision as improper. But she also knew something deeper than mere procedure. She knew that justice sometimes required flexibility, that the rules were meant to serve truth and fairness, not to obscure them. By 5:30 p.m., Judge had made her decision. She instructed to prepare the formal written order. It would be extensive, detailed, and carefully reasoned, the kind of decision that could withstand appellate scrutiny, that would stand up to legal challenge, that would demonstrate that she had not acted arbitrarily or capriciously. The written opinion took 3 days to finalize. Judge worked late into the evenings, crafting each sentence with precision. On Friday, March 17th, 2 days after the hearing, the order was filed with the court clerk and copies were distributed to all parties involved. In re the custody of Emma Martinez. The ruling began with a recitation of the facts and a summary of the allegations. It outlined David Martinez's claims that he was a devoted father being falsely accused, and Isabella Martinez's counterclaims that her ex-partner had engaged in physical and emotional abuse. Then it addressed Emma's testimony. The court finds that the testimony of the minor child, Emma Martinez, was credible, consistent, and corroborated by physical evidence and prior police reports. The child demonstrated remarkable specificity in her recollection of incidents, including contextual details such as timing and circumstances that suggest genuine memory rather than fabrication or coaching. The court notes that the minor's testimony remained consistent under rigorous cross-examination. The court further observes that the minor's emotional responses were appropriate and proportionate to the subjects being discussed. While the court recognizes that children of tender years present challenges in terms of testimonial reliability, the evidence in this case suggests that the minor child was providing truthful testimony about her experiences and observations. The opinion then addressed the procedural matter that would become most controversial. The court acknowledges that the presence of a comfort animal during the minor's testimony represents a departure from standard courtroom procedure. However, the court finds that such presence was instrumental in enabling a severely traumatized child to access her own memories and communicate truthfully about them. The court is satisfied that the animal's presence did not prejudice the respondent's right to cross-examination or his ability to defend against the allegations. Furthermore, the court notes that while the presence of the animal may have provided emotional support to the witness, it did not change the fundamental facts of what the minor child had witnessed. The animal was not a participant in the proceedings. It was merely a conduit to truth. This paragraph would later be cited in legal journals and discussed in law school classrooms across the country. It represented a judicial acknowledgement that sometimes the pursuit of truth required breaking rules. The custody determination itself was unambiguous. Based upon the totality of the evidence presented, including but not limited to the testimony of the minor child, the court finds by clear and convincing evidence that it is in the best interests of Emma Martinez to be placed in the primary physical custody of Isabella Martinez, her mother. The respondent, David Martinez, shall be granted supervised visitation with the minor child, not to exceed 8 hours per week, with all such visits to be supervised by a court-approved supervisor. Respondent is further ordered to complete a comprehensive anger management program within 6 months and to undergo psychiatric evaluation and treatment as recommended by the evaluating physician. Respondent's unsupervised custody rights shall not be restored unless and until he has successfully completed all required programs, and the court is satisfied that such restoration is in the best interests of the minor child. The ruling also addressed the broader issue. The court further notes that this decision reflects the court's assessment that respondent's history of volatile behavior, combined with the minor child's credible testimony regarding witnessing domestic violence, creates an environment that is not conducive to the child's safety and well-being. While the court recognizes that respondent has the legal right to a relationship with his daughter, that right must be subordinate to the child's fundamental right to safety. When the order was announced in open court on Friday afternoon, the reactions were immediate and visceral. Isabella wept openly, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. Her attorney, Mr., placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, and even he appeared moved by the judgment. David Martinez's face turned a deep shade of red. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is bullshit," he shouted. "This is a setup. My daughter's been brainwashed." "Mr. Martinez," judge said coldly, "you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, remove him." As David was escorted out of the courtroom by 2 bailiffs, Ms. Thornton remained seated, her expression suggesting controlled fury. She would file an appeal, certainly. She would argue that the judge had been prejudiced, that the presence of the dog had influenced her judgment, that the child's testimony was unreliable. But everyone in the courtroom understood that the decision was likely to hold. In her chambers after the courtroom had been cleared, Judge sat at her desk once more. She thought about Emma, about the frightened girl who had found courage in the presence of a dog, about the child who had risked her father's anger to speak truth, about the 4-year-old who would now have a chance to grow up safely. She thought about the K9 police dog who had somehow understood something that years of legal training and judicial experience might have missed, that sometimes the most powerful testimony comes not from words alone, but from the presence of something that helps a traumatized person feel safe enough to speak. Judge made a notation in her personal journal, something she rarely did. It simply read, "Justice is sometimes served not by rules but by compassion. 6 months had passed since Judge's ruling on that pivotal March afternoon. The seasons had turned. Spring had given way to early summer, and the world had continued its relentless forward motion, indifferent to the personal transformations that had occurred in the lives of a few people and one remarkable dog. It was September now, and the late summer heat had begun to break. School had started again, and Emma Martinez, now 4 years and 8 months old, was preparing to enter pre-kindergarten at Riverside Academy, a well-regarded private school that her mother had selected with care. Isabella had insisted on a school with strong counseling resources and a trauma-informed approach to education. The custody arrangement had held. David Martinez had completed the first phase of his court-ordered anger management program, though his progress had been described by his therapist as inconsistent and defensive. His supervised visitation with Emma had occurred exactly twice in 6 months. The first visit had been marked by tears and awkwardness. The second had gone slightly better, though Emma remained guarded and anxious during the entire supervised encounter. The court-appointed supervisor had noted that, while David appeared to be making efforts toward behavioral change, Emma remained fearful and emotionally withdrawn in his presence. But with her mother, Emma was beginning to bloom. It was Isabella who initiated the request. On a Tuesday morning in early September, she called the police department's administrative office and asked to speak with someone in the K-9 unit. The call was transferred through several departments before finally reaching Captain, the head of the K-9 division and Officer Henderson's supervisor. "I'd like to request a meeting with Officer Henderson," Isabella said, her voice carrying a note of nervous hope. "I know this is unusual, but Emma has been asking about the dog. She talks about him almost every day. I thought it might be good for her to see him again, if that's possible." Captain had reviewed the case file. He was aware of the unusual circumstances that had surrounded the custody hearing, and he had read Judge's opinion with considerable interest. He was also aware that had become something of a minor celebrity within the department. Officers would stop by his kennel to pay their respects to the dog who had, in their estimation, helped save a child's life. "Let me speak with Officer Henderson," said. "I think we can arrange something." Officer James Henderson's initial reaction was cautious. He had followed proper procedure after the trial, refraining from any further contact with Emma or her family. He understood the importance of maintaining professional boundaries, of not becoming emotionally entangled in cases. But when Captain explained what Isabella was requesting, Henderson found himself unable to refuse. "She's doing okay?" Henderson asked, concern evident in his voice. "According to her mother, she's doing much better," replied. "She's starting school, she's in therapy, she's healing, and apparently the dog is helping her process that healing." "Then we should arrange it," Henderson said simply. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday at the police department's training facility, a large, open area with grassy fields and obstacle courses where the K-9 units trained and practiced their skills. It was a controlled environment, professional but not as formal and intimidating as a courtroom or police station. Emma arrived at 10:00 a.m. on a bright Saturday morning, her hand gripping her mother's hand tightly. She wore a yellow sundress and white sneakers, and her dark hair had been braided carefully by Isabella that morning. As they walked across the parking lot toward the training facility, Emma's eyes were wide with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. She had talked about for months, drawing pictures of him in her therapy sessions, asking her mother repeatedly if they could visit him, incorporating him into her bedtime stories as a protector and friend. Officer Henderson stood at the entrance to the training facility, and beside him, sitting with perfect obedience, was. The moment Emma saw the dog, something profound shifted in her. She released her mother's hand and began to move forward slowly at first, then with increasing speed. She wasn't running recklessly, she was walking with purpose, as if drawn toward something essential, something necessary for her continued healing. She called out, her voice filled with joy and recognition. Officer Henderson released the dog from his heel position and stood, his tail beginning to wag. But the dog didn't rush forward aggressively or excitedly. Instead, he moved toward Emma with the same measured, deliberate pace he had used in that courthouse hallway 6 months earlier. He seemed to understand once again that this small human needed gentleness, not exuberance. When Emma reached, she knelt down, something she would never have been able to do 6 months ago, so consumed had she been by fear and trauma. She wrapped her arms around the dog's neck and stood perfectly still, allowing her embrace, his head turning slightly so he could rest his chin gently on her shoulder. "Hi," Emma whispered. "I missed you so much. I'm safe now. Mommy kept me safe, and I go to school now, and I talked to doctor about my feelings. I'm getting better." Officer Henderson felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He looked at Isabella, who stood nearby with her own hand covering her mouth, her expression overwhelmed with emotion. She stepped forward and placed a hand gently on her daughter's shoulder. "Do you want to go for a walk with?" Isabella asked softly. Emma nodded enthusiastically, was reattached to his lead, and Officer Henderson walked with Emma, Isabella, and the dog across the training facility's grounds. They moved slowly, allowing Emma to set the pace. The child talked continuously, about school, about therapy, about her fears that were gradually diminishing. She talked about wanting to be brave, about wanting to help other people who were scared, the way it helped her. "When I grow up," Emma announced with the kind of certainty that only children possessed, "I want to work with dogs. I want to help people who are scared." "That's a beautiful dream," Isabella said, her voice thick with emotion. They spent 2 hours together, Emma, her mother, Officer Henderson, and they sat in the grass while Emma threw a tennis ball for to retrieve. She laughed, genuine, uninhibited, joyful laughter, when the dog brought the ball back to her, his tail wagging with pride at having pleased the small human he'd come to care for. Before leaving, Isabella approached Officer Henderson with a formal request. Emma's therapist, Doctor, has suggested that regular interaction with therapy dogs could be tremendously beneficial for her continued healing. I was wondering if there were any programs in the area that specialize in animal-assisted therapy for trauma survivors. "There are," Officer Henderson said. "Let me get you some information, but I'll also speak with Captain about something else. Is near retirement age. He served the department incredibly well. We've been thinking about what his next chapter might look like. I wonder if the department might be willing to consider a formal program where could serve as a therapy dog, not full-time away from law enforcement work, but perhaps splitting his time." "That would be remarkable," Isabella said, tears streaming down her face. "For Emma and for other children who might need what can provide." Over the following weeks, Captain, Officer Henderson, and the police department's administration began discussions about creating a formal program. It would be called the K9 Healing Initiative, a program where selected police dogs, particularly those nearing retirement or those with particular temperament suited to such work, would provide therapy support to trauma survivors, particularly children. Emma would be the program's first official participant. She would begin formal therapy sessions at a local trauma center, under the supervision of doctor and with handler present. Other traumatized children would follow. His role would expand. He would remain an active law enforcement dog, but he would also become something more: a healer, a bridge between trauma and recovery, a living reminder that sometimes the most powerful medicine came not from courts or lawyers or even judges, but from the simple, unconditional presence of a creature who understood, on some level that transcended human comprehension, what it meant to need saving. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to turn gold and crimson, Emma started her pre-kindergarten classes and her formal therapy sessions with. Her nightmares began to diminish. Her anxiety decreased. She smiled more frequently, laughed more readily, and spoke with increasing confidence about her feelings and experiences. One afternoon, As Emma sat with during a therapy session, she turned to Doctor and said something that would become the unofficial motto of the K9 Healing Initiative. Saved me, not just in court. He saved me by showing me that there are safe things in the world, things that love you no matter what. Officer Henderson, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the therapy room observing the session, felt something profound shift within him. He had been a police officer for 15 years. He had trained dogs, tracked criminals, and served his community with dedication and honor. But in that moment, he understood that had done something far more important than any drug bust or criminal apprehension. Had saved a child's soul. And in doing so, he had created a legacy that would extend far beyond his years of service, touching the lives of countless traumatized children who would come after Emma, each finding in the presence of a trained dog the courage to speak their truth and begin their journey toward healing. The extraordinary story of what a 4-year-old had said to a K9 dog in a courthouse hallway had become something far greater. It had become a roadmap for compassion, a testament to the power of connection, and a permanent reminder that sometimes justice is not just about legal verdicts and judicial rulings. Sometimes justice is about a child finding her voice, a dog finding his purpose, and a world learning that healing is possible when we're brave enough to reach out and compassionate enough to reach back. Retry can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.